Hello, and welcome to Building Capacity to Prevent and Address Gender-Based Violence Against 2S LGBTQ plus Youth. This training session is designed and delivered with a focus on 2S LGBTQ plus community organizations and service providers. It is also a condensed version of a broader training that we offered in 2021 and 2022 for 2S LGBTQ community organizations on this same topic. We are creating this video to help everybody get access to the knowledge, tools, and skills developed through our first round of training. To introduce myself, my name is Faye Johnstone. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm the executive director of Wisdom to Action. I live and work on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, colonially known as Ottawa, and I have the pleasure of having served as Wisdom to Action's executive director and principal consultant for the past 4 years. To introduce the SAFER project, SAFER stands for Safer Access for Everyone in the Rainbow, and it is a 3-year initiative focused on addressing and preventing gender-based violence against 2S LGBTQ plus youth. This initiative is made possible with the generous support of Women and Gender Equality Canada, and every activity is developed and implemented alongside a Partner Advisory Council and Youth Advisory Council. The Partner Advisory Council consists of the Two Spirits in Motion Society, Access Open Minds, Kickstand, YWCA Halifax, Gris Montréal, Kind Space, Elder Loreen Blue Waters, the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity, and the Enchanté Network. In particular, we'd like to highlight the role of the CCGSD and the Enchanté Network in facilitating these trainings with 2SLGQ organizations in this past year. In terms of the SAFER project writ large, the initiative includes training such as this, training both for 2S LGBTQIA plus serving organizations, as well as training for youth serving organizations that may be inclusive of, but not have a specific focus on 2S LGBTQIA plus issues or young people. The initiative also includes bystander intervention training, as well as regional and national events to share knowledge, tools, and innovative practices. And finally, a national public education campaign to address gender-based violence against 2S LGBTQIA plus young people. We always like to begin a training with a land acknowledgement, recognizing that many of us are joining from unceded, unsurrendered Indigenous territories and are working on the lands of many Indigenous nations. Each and every one of us will have a different relationship to the land, but many of us are in this work and in these spaces as settlers. Myself, as someone who lives and works on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, I believe that it is of deep importance to each and every one of us that we recognize the connections between homophobia and transphobia, between misogyny and sexism, and their roots, which are often connected to colonialism and colonial violence. When we talk about gender and sexuality, we have to recognize that these concepts, that issues of systemic homophobia and transphobia were imported to this land as part of a colonial process. And thereby it is an onus on us to do justice to Indigenous communities, indigiqueer and two-spirit peoples through a truly decolonial approach to addressing gender-based violence against 2S LGBTQIA plus communities. On your screen now, you'll see a link to native-land.ca, where you can learn more about the land that you reside upon, and we encourage folks to look for partnerships and opportunities to support local Indigenous organizations and communities. In particular, we'd like to highlight a report published by the MMIWG2S LGBTQIA plus sub-working group of the MMIWG process. The sub-working group created a final report centering Two-Spirit and Indigenous communities in conversations and actions on gender-based violence. This report outlines key activities and actions that settler organizations working on GBV can undertake to ensure they are doing justice to and supporting MMIWG2S LGBTQIA plus people. In particular, through decolonizing our understanding of gender and sexuality, through ensuring Two-Spirit histories and education are reflected, that cultural practices are supported and included within both GBV prevention and education. It is also important that we recognize and address histories of trauma through the imposition of settler colonialism and recognize the unique intersection of gender-based violence, and colonialism on this land. We encourage folks to read the MMIWDG2S LGBTQIA+ supplemental report, and you should see a link for it on your screen now as well. Now, in terms of the objectives for this training session, first and foremost, we are hoping to deepen knowledge on the context and realities of GBV against 2S LGBTQ+ youth. Second, to learn and strengthen practical skills and approaches to prevent and respond to GBV against 2S LGBTQ young people. And third, to identify ways to commit and act on practical skills and approaches to address this issue. Our necessary caveat to this session is that it is not a 2S LGBTQ 101 workshops. We will not be covering introductory topics. The focus of this session is on 2S LGBTQ youth and GBV. We always want to give space for folks to be at different points in their learning journeys, but we encourage folks, if they're looking for that 101 foundation, to explore other workshops or resources. And a great way to start is to look at the libraries of the organizations that we listed on our Partner Advisory Committee just a few moments ago. To set the stage, we're going to start by talking about GBV as it impacts 2S LGBTQ+ youth. To use the definition of Women and Gender Equality Canada, GBV is defined as violence based on gender norms and unequal power dynamics, perpetrated against someone based on their gender expression, their gender identity, or their perceived gender. It takes many forms, including physical, economic, as well as emotional or psychological abuse. The biggest thing to take away from this definition is that gender-based violence is all-encompassing. GBV takes many different forms and rears its head in our communities in many different ways. In particular, within this definition, the focus not only on gender, but on gender expression and identity helps us better understand the ways that violence of a gender nature will impact each and every one of us differently based on our social location, based on, yes, our gender, but also on other realities, such as our race, our class, our ability, and more. This definition of GBV challenges us to look at the intersections of identity and experience, and to bring a more nuanced, complex, and critical lens to our efforts to address and prevent GBV against 2S LGBTQIA+ youth. In particular, our definition of GBV often does not recognize the experiences of 2S LGBTQIA+ communities. We recognize that GBV writ large is something we need to condemn and to resist, but we don't have a broad understanding of how GBV shapes the realities of different members of our communities. In particular, when we talk about GBV, we need to recognize the role of systemic homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, but we also need to recognize all of the other intersections. And this visual from Women and Gender Equality Canada helps get a little bit deeper into the other factors that shape somebody's experience in life, generally speaking, and in GBV specifically. All too often, the way that queer and trans communities experience GBV is based on our deviation from the norm. The more that we look gender nonconforming, the greater that our appearance and our conduct might deviate from those that are expected of cisgender, heterosexual men or women, the greater degree of harm that we face. That harm has a personal, interpersonal component. It also has those structural components, as too many 2S LGBTQIA+ young people grow up in a world where they are all too aware of the violence and discrimination that they, as queer and trans people, are more likely to face. In particular, to understand GBV and 2S LGBTQ young people, on your screen now, you'll see some examples of what GBV looks like based off a report Wisdom to Action conducted with over 500 2S LGBTQIA+ young people across Canada. Through this report, we heard in particular about unsafe family contexts, especially for trans, gender diverse, and racialized young people. There is a unique degree of GBV that rears its head when you're in a home that you are not safe in, and where gender-based violence in connection with homophobia and transphobia renders you unsafe in your own home. Realities of sexual violence, both sexual assault and intimate partner violence, are much less talked about when they come to 2S LGBTQI+ young people. The prevalence of sexual violence against young bi women, young lesbian women, young trans and gender diverse people is a significant issue for queer and trans communities and young people in particular. realities of street harassment and a lack of public safety, the worry when you're walking to school in the morning or when you're headed home in the evening, the worry that simply being out as a queer and trans person in public can be like a lightning rod for harassment and discrimination. While our schools have made significant steps in the right direction, we know that violence in schools, from bullying to verbal and physical harassment to social violence, peer violence, and the lack of support, can create situations where 2SLGBTQIA plus young people are not safe at home or in their own classrooms, even as our schools and teachers across the country have made huge strides on inclusion. We know we still have much more work to do. A less talked about element of GBV is the way in which GBV thrives due to negative conceptions or perceptions of 2SLGBTQIA plus people. The lack of positive role models and a media world where all too often we're talking about 2SLGBTQ plus communities in a negative or deficit-based context further exacerbates the vulnerability of young queer and trans people. We also, as I've mentioned before, know that GBV doesn't impact us all equally. That racialized, trans, and gender nonconforming young folks, as well as other young folks who live at the intersections of multiple identities and forms of oppression, experience both heightened and distinct forms of GBV. Evidence has demonstrated that 72% of racialized 2SLGBTQI plus respondents had experienced verbal harassment, and 49% had experienced sexual harassment in the past 5 years. This demonstrates that compounded identities create heightened risk and heightened prevalence of GBV. We know that 84% of trans people in Canada avoided a public space due to fears of harassment and discrimination, that 25% of our young folks don't feel safe at home, that 64% of trans and non-binary youth experienced verbal sexual harassment in the past year, and 30% or 34% of queer and trans youth writ large experienced physical sexual harassment. What this tells us, what this paints, is not a happy picture. It's a picture where many of our young folks are still struggling, are still facing violence on a near daily basis, and demonstrates just how important it is that we do more to build capacity to address and prevent GBV against this population. In terms of the impact of gender-based violence on 2SLGBTQ plus youth, this is an area where we need further research because there is minimal data on the impact of GBV on queer and trans young people, but qualitative studies have found a number of common elements. First and foremost, there's the mental health impact, the sense of shame and guilt, the internalized messages that many queer and trans people receive that paints them in a poor light, that makes it so that our young folks are more likely to struggle with depression, anxiety, with substance misuse, and with other poor mental health outcomes due to the broader systems of homophobia and transphobia compounded by gender-based violence. The fear of harassment in public and virtual GBV online means that many of our folks live in greater isolation, are struggling to connect with peers who are supportive, and may be more likely to stay at home in order to avoid the risk of violence and harassment in IRL context, in-person contexts. All of this is further compounded by realities of trauma associated with GBV. If you're a survivor of sexual violence, if you're a survivor of street harassment or psychological abuse, you walk with those stories and experiences. And so all three of these give us a bit of an insight into what impact GBV has on our young folks, but it is by no means comprehensive. There are many other ways in which GBV shapes negatively the lived experiences and everyday realities of queer and trans young people. Within your role as a service provider, there are many instances and opportunities for you to be a champion of 2SLGBTQ inclusion and to ensure that you are supporting the 2SLGBTQ young people in your work who may be impacted by gender-based violence. First and foremost, you can identify and intervene during instances of gender-based violence. You can be the individual who jumps in when a trans person is being misgendered. You can be the person who in public spaces intervenes when you see an instance of a homophobic or transphobic or biphobic gender-based violence against a young person. You can work in your own organization to create inclusive physical and virtual environments that enable young people to engage safely, to reach out for support, and to combat that isolation and fear many of our young folks have when interacting with service providers and services. Third, you can educate about homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, as well as other intersecting forms of oppression as a means of preventing gender-based violence. Through knowledge sharing and capacity building, we can bring more folks along with us and create more safer spaces for queer and trans young folks through that ripple effect. Fourth, and maybe foremost, we can support young folks impacted by or coping with GBV. We can help young people develop tools to keep themselves safe while tackling the broader systems that perpetuate a lack of safety. And we can help young folks who do experience GBV develop mechanisms to care for themselves and to cope with those experiences so that they can be as well as possible while navigating life as a young queer and trans person. Now, to shift and to begin looking at some of those skills and capacities that we can develop, we're going to start with an exploration of what inclusive environments can look like with regards to gender-based violence. We often think of safe spaces in three layers. There's the physical safety component, the organizational safety piece, and the interpersonal safety piece. In terms of physical safety, that can look like spaces that are discreet and prioritize confidentiality. Many of our young folks may have had negative experiences in interacting in healthcare settings, or may not feel welcomed in areas that have a high degree of institutionalization within them. Chill and inviting, calming sort of physical spaces can be a great invitation for our young people. Additionally, spaces that folks can access without worrying that their friend or family member might know that they're accessing those spaces. So spaces that allow confidentiality and some degree of anonymity while interacting with services and spaces are always ideal. In terms of organizational safety, we should explore ways to build relationships with other organizations that have trusting relationships with different members of 2SLGQIA+ young people. That can be building relationships with cutie BIPOC orgs or indigenous queer and trans community organizations. It can be working with other GBV organizations to ensure that we and our colleagues and partners are all on board and committed to creating safer spaces for 2SLGQIA+ youth. It can also be about recognizing that some partnerships may make some service users feel uncomfortable, that we should have clear information about how information shared by a queer or trans young person about GBV, how and if it will be shared and shared with whom. That transparency from an organizational safety component allows young folks to walk through our services knowing their privacy will be respected, their confidentiality kept, and knowing in which particular circumstances organizations may have to reach out to police or emergency response services should a young person say or do a particular thing. Lastly, there's the interpersonal safety component, and that's where intentionally inclusive language, like respecting folks' pronouns or names, making sure that we are approaching issues from a culturally humble lens, all of these allow for the personal safety and interpersonal safety between a service provider or community worker or a queer and trans young person. We can be mindful of the perceived privilege of being, or the perceived power and privilege associated with being a service provider. We can be aware that for some people that in and of itself creates a barrier, and that we as service providers do walk with significant power when working with queer and trans young people. That process of critical self-reflection, of checking in with ourselves, checking with our biases, checking in with our practices, allows us to have a more honest and strong relationship with queer and trans young folks walking through our doors. Lastly, we can move forward with a strength-based approach, avoiding deficit-based language that roots the issue in queer and trans identity or experience. We can focus on the strength of our communities, on the resilience of our young people, and help people build the skills and tools to be healthy and happy in their communities, to navigate complicated situations, and making sure throughout that we're not emphasizing a connection between being a queer and trans person and being more likely to struggle with mental health, because these are not individual issues, these are systems issues. We can also move forward with a trauma-informed approach. A trauma-informed approach recognizes that many queer and trans people walk with trauma, have had adverse negative experiences, a traumatic event, either one event or a series, a repeat of their multiple experiences, that completely overwhelm an individual's ability to cope or integrate the ideas and emotions involved with that experience. Recognizing that queer and trans communities are more likely to have experienced trauma is a foundation that can inform every aspect of our gender-based violence interventions. Some of the key features of a trauma-informed approach include realization of the widespread impact of trauma and understanding of potential paths for recovery, and recognizing always that young people deserve autonomy and agency in establishing what pathways to recovery and what recovery in and of itself might look like. We can recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in our clients and our families and our staff and others involved within these systems. We can be mindful that responses from 2SLGQIA plus young folks may be associated with trauma, and that it is our responsibility to lean forward with care, compassion, and humility. We can respond to GBV by integrating knowledge about trauma into our policies and procedures, our practices, and our settings, ensuring that we're doing things like adding content warnings, that we are supporting folks before and after events that may have been tough or triggering for them. Through all of this work, we can also resist re-traumatizing members of our communities and of our staff teams. Many of us may be 2SLGQIA plus people working on these issues, and there is a risk to ourselves because this work takes an additional toll when it is deeply connected to our own identities and our own experiences. Throughout our work in direct practice, as individuals and as organizations, we should strive to ensure we are not re-traumatizing members of our communities and staff members through the work that we do. To shift a bit from structural and organizational approaches to everyday interventions, one of the most important things that we can do as service providers is to be a good bystander. That can involve pre-planning with community members and service users, to recognize if you are working with a client to go visit an apartment with a landlord, to check in with that client beforehand about what they'd want you to do if somebody yelled something at them while you were walking to this space together. It can be connecting with folks to develop safety plans for after an instance to help folks care and cope with that experience. In terms of an actual intervention, in terms of bystander intervention at its core, there are three big steps that we recommend in terms of guiding what such an intervention can look like. The first is to maximize safety and prioritize de-escalation. Our job in this space is not to tell a homophobe or a transphobe that they are a homophobe or a transphobe. Our intervention has to be minded at maintaining or increasing the safety of the individual currently subjected to harassment. Often that can be about getting out of a particular space, about finding a safe space to get away to and recuperate. And it can also look like centering de-escalation, trying to bring down the angry energies or to distract from the incident in question through a conversation or bringing somebody away from the space in question. Through this work, it is integral that we recognize our own risk, that we recognize that we as individuals may also be likely to experience gender-based violence. And so we should support the young folks who are bearing the brunt of that harm, but we should also, when engaging in bystander interventions, be aware of the potential dangers to ourselves, and again lead with a spirit of de-escalation and maximizing safety so that we ourselves and the young person we're intervening on behalf of can get into a safer space and find an opportunity to decompress after a negative incident. There are some things that we should do and some things that we shouldn't do when it comes to bystander intervention. One of the 3 things to do is to keep yourself and others safe, again, always leaning into that safety-based approach. Second, to make your presence as a witness known. A lot of gender-based violence happens because no one says or does anything. Because if someone is harassing a queer or trans young person on the street, they are often hoping that nobody else intervenes, reacts, or even notices. Making your presence known by saying hello, by jumping in and engaging in by making your presence known physically, these all help make sure that the individual knows that this isn't going to be an anonymized experience, that the individual who's being harassed isn't going through this alone. Thirdly, we can take cues from the individual being harassed. Throughout this work, it is integral that we do not imagine we have all of the solutions and all of the answers, and that we take the cue from the person being subjected to gender-based violence in terms of what their needs are, in terms of how they'd like us to respond, and what their priorities look like following such an altercation. The main things not to do are quite simple. First and foremost, to not escalate the situation. Calling somebody a homophobe or a transphobe or a bigot in these moments is often not a productive endeavor. What we want more than anything is for the situation to end and for the young person we're intervening on behalf of to get somewhere safe. Fundamentally, however, the biggest thing not to do is nothing at all. All too often, violence against our young folks is ignored and is therefore approved. If we don't intervene, even in the small ways of checking in with somebody after, we send a silent message that this conduct is acceptable. And so in this work, the last option that is never a true option is to do nothing at all. All too often, our young folks are left alone to face these experiences, and we have a responsibility to reduce that isolation and to take the burden off of our young folks to deal with hate, bigotry, and harassment all on their loans. In many of our contexts, we as service providers may hear disclosures, and we may have obligations associated with those disclosures. If you are hearing a disclosure about GBV, there are 4 simple things you can do and should do to support them in those immediate moments. First and foremost, thank them for trusting you, because it takes immense courage to disclose an experience of GBV, and we should be mindful that that encouragement and thanks tells them that we know it takes a step to trust us, and thanks them for the trust they are putting in us by confiding about their experiences. Second, we can affirm their experiences of harm. All too often, true LGBTQIA+ young folks have their experiences minimized and dismissed, have the harm that we experience in this world set aside and ignored. It is integral that we affirm the harm that they experience through a given instance of GBV. We can also then center their needs and ask them what they need from us and how we can support them in these moments. Because it is always it always has to be grounded in their experiences, in their needs, and what they want in terms of where we go from here. And that brings us to our last step, which, of course, is planning those next steps. Developing a plan in terms of how to support the young person after an incident, who and how you'll bring this to the attention of other folks, how the young person will cope with any adverse feelings in the time after an incident, or identifying potential services and supports that they can access to care for themselves and reach out for further support after a critical incident. Now, recognizing that many of us may have duties to report in association with hearing about an adverse or critical life event for a young person, it is integral that we make young folks aware of whom we work with and what our responsibilities and obligations might be pursuant to a disclosure, because their autonomy and agency and who and how they disclose to is integral to affirming a youth-focused and centered and rights-based approach for addressing gender-based violence. Many of us as 2S LGBTQIA+ service providers have dual relationships in this work. We may be both providers and community members. And understanding the role and the boundaries between our identity as a community member and our employment as a service provider is essential for both our own health, our own well-being, and for effective care with queer and trans young people. We are often pushed to stretch our boundaries because of a personal desire to create change. We're all too often the person who will respond to that text after hours or that phone call or that late Facebook message or DM. We have to ensure that we have clear boundaries in this work so that what happens in our work lives does not take over our personal lives, and that we make sure that young folks know when we can be expected to be available to them and when we are unable to provide a particular service or support, or when we may be off the clock after a given time on a given day. When it comes to boundaries and referrals, we should also think about making warm referrals because we are not always the right provider. While we do have expertise in our roles and in our work, there may be moments where something is out of our depth or requires a niche expertise that we are not able to provide. Part of this work as service providers is to recognize when the right call is to help somebody access another service or intervention. In those moments, it is important that we don't just send somebody away with a business card or an email address, but that as best we can, we help by making a warm referral to the right provider through an e-introduction or joining that young person on their first visit. These are ways that we can help young folks connect from our service to another and ensure that no one falls through the gap that sometimes shows up in between. We can think about making informed choices and helping young folks make informed choices by vetting local GBV services and other relevant youth services in the region to ensure that when we send a trans person, for example, to a local shelter, we know that that trans person will have a positive and trans-inclusive experience while accessing that service. We can also, as I mentioned before, consider accompaniment, seeing if the young person would like to have us bring them to this service or join for that first meeting. That connection from one service to another service almost always improves the experience and the likelihood that the young person will access that additional service that you were referring them to. Lastly, we can explore follow-up and check-ins, following up with the service provider to ensure that handoff went effectively, checking in with the young person to see if there's other services and supports that they need, or any other ways that we can work with them and help support them. At this stage, we invite you, as somebody watching this video, to ask yourself and reflect upon your work and community boundaries. How do you make sure that you are maintaining those boundaries and that you're caring for yourself, particularly given the vicarious trauma and burnout that often arises within queer and trans organizations, given the sensitivity, depth, and personal connection of many of the topics that we work upon? We can also look at assessing risk. We can work with young folks to help them assess the risk of harm, to understand where folks are at and where they may need to be supported. By being aware of and responding to high-risk indicators in a way that is, again, strength-based and not deficit-based, we can help young folks identify the places and spaces they feel unsafe and the steps that they can take to maximize their safety if they need to be in particular spaces where they feel less safe than they do in others. We can develop plans to assess risk and to identify risk factors that we can best mitigate. And by working with young folks in that process to identify risk, identify strategies to reduce risk, and strategies to address harm in the event that a risk becomes actualized, we can help ourselves understand the context of our young folks while helping those young folks understand the potential risks and the ways of overcoming or reducing those risks that they are able to bring into their everyday life. Which brings us, of course, to the concept of safety planning. Safety planning is a practice that many of us in our workplaces and organizations have likely already developed a capacity for, but to review it, safety planning in essence is helping folks identify strategies to protect themselves and put into action during moments of risk or crisis. A safety planning process should always start by acknowledging what young folks have already done to keep themselves safe. And if you start from there, there's often an opportunity to build our assets and help young folks understand both their own resilience and strength and their own ability to critically analyze their context and identify means of maximizing their safety. A safety planning process often identifies safe places and people. The place you can go if some stranger in public is mistreating you, and the person you can call if you need either crisis intervention support or just a friend to decompress with after an incident. Safety planning also includes identifying mechanisms to support ourselves and to calm and cope with mental distress after an incidence of GBV. That can be identifying fidget toys or wellness strategies or self-care opportunities to help people make sure that they aren't walking with the pain of an incident held within themselves and unaddressed. It can also be about identifying resources and services and other supports that are available to a young person so that they know where to call or where to go if they are in need of critical intervention. All of this is about service providers supporting young folks to help those young folks keep themselves safe. If you'd like, on the screen now, you'll see a link that will take you to Wisdom to Action and Spectrum Waterloo's Trans and Gender Diverse Mental Health Wellness and Suicide Prevention Toolkit, which includes both resources on bystander intervention in combating street harassment, and most notably, near the end sections, a template safety plan that you can use in your own organization and in your own services. Now, recognizing that gender-based violence is a reality that many of our young folks walk with every day, and that unfortunately we cannot eradicate all of those structures and experiences in the span of one initiative, training, or workshop, it is integral that we also identify coping strategies. Those can be self-care strategies like affirmations and breathing exercises or muscle relaxation activities. Or they can be coping strategies like venting or connecting in peer spaces, using a buddy system if you need to go to a particular place that you're worried about. It can be as easy as turning everything off and watching Netflix for a few hours. Or it can be yelling about how horrible homophobia and transphobia are on Twitter. My biggest emphasis with these coping strategies is all too often after an experience of harassment, we internalize the blame. We either think of that experience as something that is so normal that it's just every day and we shouldn't care about it. Or we imagine that we are, we internalize this message of shame and stigma. On both fronts, it is integral that we externalize that blame and that we go through a process of dealing with the negative emotions that are associated with an instance of gender-based violence. We cannot hold these experiences and moments in ourselves because that sends a negative message and internalizes a negative message about our identities, about our own strengths as autonomous young people navigating a complicated and often violent world. As service providers, we can work with our young folks to build their capacity to have and implement these strategies in instances where they need them. With that, we have come to the conclusion of our condensed version of the SAFER Project's training, building capacity to address and prevent gender-based violence against 2S LGBTQ youth, intended for 2S LGBTQ serving organizations. If you'd like to learn more about the project or connect with our team, you can reach us at the email now included on your screen, safer@wisdom2action.org. It's been an honor and a pleasure to facilitate this session with you. I hope you've taken value from it. Thank you so much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.